Audible's romance collection has something to satisfy every side of you. When it comes to what kind of romance you're into, you don't have to choose just one. Fancy a dalliance with a duke, or maybe a steamy billionaire. You could find a book boyfriend in the city and another one tearing it up on the hockey field. And if nothing on this earth satisfies, you can always find love in another realm. Discover modern rom-coms from authors like Lily Chu and Ali Hazelwood, the latest romantasy series from Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros, plus Regency favorites like Bridgerton and Outlander. And of course, all the really steamy stuff. Your first great love story is free when you sign up for a free 30-day trial at audible.com/Wondery. That's audible.com/Wondery.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
When we interviewed people afterwards, we're talking all of these pretty seasoned law enforcement prosecution people who, have been doing it for years and whatnot. And the amount of people who cried when talking to us about this case was very notable. And then that was making me cry. So it was just a mess. But it was one of those things where these people felt this so deeply. I don't think that really comes across when you're just talking about people testifying on the stand, or you're talking about, just kind of, something that's words on a page. But I think just the impact this had on people and certainly the families and certainly the Delphi community, but also the people who actually investigated it. That was very real.
That's Áine Cain, the co-host of the Murder Sheet podcast and co-author of the book Shadow of the Bridge, The Delphi Murders and the Dark Side of the American Heartland.
It's a community that is tightly knit and that takes care of its own. And they take care of people. That's part of who they are, their Midwestern values, for lack of a better word. Even before the trial, there was a day when Áine and I were in town for a hearing. And I recall a couple of people came running out of the store where they worked, and they were carrying a plate of cookies and said, "Oh, here, I think you might be hungry." And they give us these cookies and they run back into the store. So it was just a spirit of generosity in that town. And it also goes back to the day when the girls were found missing, because so many people took off work just to do whatever they could to try to help these families and try to help find these girls.
That's Kevin Greenlee, the other co-host of the Murder Sheet and co-author of the book. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. On an unseasonably warm February day in 2017 in Delphi, Indiana, two friends, 13-year-old Abby Williams and 14-year-old Libby German, decided on a whim to head out to the trails near their homes. Abby and Libby were going to walk through the trails and onto an abandoned railroad bridge that crossed a wide creek. The Monon High Bridge was built in 1891 and is Indiana's second tallest bridge, its wooden ties about 63 feet above the ground. The bridge that once carried trains gave way to the feet of residents in the community. The bridge offers breathtaking views of the creek, surrounding bluffs, and forested landscapes, and a challenge. Many have made it across or halfway across the 10-foot wide bridge to crawl their way back. But Libby was brave, her friends and family said, and was taking Abby across as she had with others before. On the bridge, Libby took pictures of Abby, including one she uploaded to Snapchat, a picture of Abby in blue jeans, a maroon crew neck shirt, a light gray jacket, and black Nike shoes with white outsoles. Moments later, on a video Libby took, a man can be seen approaching at a fast clip just beyond Abby's shoulder. "Is he right there?" Abby asks Libby as she records. "Don't leave me here," Abby says a moment later. Within seconds, Libby swings the phone away, suggesting a path to get away. Then you can hear a click, a comment by one of the girls about a gun, and then a man saying, "Guys." A girl can be heard saying hi. Then the man says, "Down the hill." Prosecutors would later argue to a jury that down the hill, the man would attempt to sexually assault the girls underneath the bridge. When a van drove by on a service road, the assault was aborted, and the man led the girls across the creek where he stabbed them to death. More than 5 years after they vanished and died, in 2022, Bridge Guy was identified by investigators as a local man named Richard Allen, who was tried and convicted last year of their murders. Since 2020, Kevin Greenlee and Áine Cain have covered the murders that occurred beneath the bridge and have just completed writing their book, Shadow of the Bridge: The Delphi Murders and the Dark Side of the American Heartland. Kevin and Áine joined me today to discuss their coverage of the case, their continued investigation, the book, and Abby and Libby. So, Kevin and Áine, I wanted to thank you for coming on to talk about your book. I was very excited to, read it as somebody who has followed this case in depth since before I knew either of you. It's been quite a journey, I think, for the two of you. And one of the things that I really appreciated about the book was that I was able to sort of step back and look at the story from, the big picture and really get the perspectives of the different players who were involved almost from the beginning. And I walked away as somebody who has followed this case very closely, feeling like I had a much greater understanding of what happened from 2017 to today. So I really appreciate, the contribution and what I was able to get out of the book. And it's really, the last time you guys were on, I made the point that one of the things that you guys have done in your work is you bore witness for the girls, the two girls who walked out onto that bridge that day, and that really came through in the book and the care that you took with it, and bringing in all the different perspectives and voices, and really, I think also in clearing up what for me, or for a lot of people, were a lot of misconceptions. So I feel like it's a real important contribution to the case.
Jason, why are you trying to make us cry right away? Thank you so much.
You so much.
That means an incredible amount to us. Just your support throughout this whole insane situation has meant so much to us. So I'm so glad. That's really validating to hear that you had that reaction to the book. And we really appreciate it. We wanted from the beginning for this to be, I think this case in particular, there's such a scope to it, and there's so many different players. What we really hope to do is try to, tell the story in a way that, first of all, made sense and sort of captured a lot of different people's contributions to it. So I think, so if we succeeded in that, then that's immensely gratifying, and thank you.
Yeah, I think you really did. I think, I think one of the things about your podcast that sort of stands out through your coverage of the entire case is, I really felt, and, this is my personal take, that one of the guiding principles for you guys was to follow the truth, not to, follow whatever bright, shiny toy. And I know from your reporting, you probably knew about all the bright, shiny toys people were dropping, and in psychology, we have this thing where it's like, trust the assessment, don't trust what's in front of you. And it's this idea that we all have these biases when we walk into certain situations. And I think of the way that you guys reported it you reported it honestly where the sort of truth was leading you, as opposed to what would get the most attention or what would be most interesting. And I think it really, it probably built for you guys, I'm guessing, just as somebody who's a reporter, a foundation of trust with the players that were involved in the case, which probably allowed them to open up to you in ways that they couldn't open up to other people. And nowhere do you say that in the book, but just as somebody who's a reporter and knows, just kind of, you get that feel that this book is really a culmination of all that hard work to be faithful to the truth during your reporting.
Yeah, I think we definitely did see that trust build up with some of these folks over time, and I think maybe that culminated a trial where they saw us showing up every day and sort of going through the Hunger Games to get in, and I think they were able to see that we were committed to getting the truth out there, and we had really not been able to have any significant interactions with a lot of the people in the book before it was all over.
Because of the gag order, of course, Judge Gull issued an order in this case basically saying that anyone involved in the case, the judge herself, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the families, the witnesses, they couldn't talk to the media, which is us. And I can tell you that the prosecutors and law enforcement, they took that very, very seriously. And so we did not have any meaningful conversations with people like the prosecutor in this case, Nicholas McClelland, until after the sentencing and the gag order was lifted. So that kind of was an interesting challenge when it came to writing the book.
Yeah, because you're trying to write as much as possible beforehand, but really it all came together in the very end once everything opened up, because that was when we were able to really find out more of what truly happened and what everyone's experiences were.
Right. And you do a good job of capturing, I think, what it felt for them. I was going to ask you guys something I don't think I've ever asked you this privately or in an interview, but what was it?
Truth.
No, it's not that bad. It's actually germane to the topic. I'll save that. I'll save those questions for some other point. But the thing that I was going to ask, I've never, if you can believe this, I've never asked you guys. I've told the story of how I became interested in the case. It had caught my attention back in 2017. I had heard that these two girls had disappeared on a bridge, were found murdered, and that one of them captured it on video. In my head, I thought to myself at the time, oh, this can be over with in a matter of days, weeks, right? Because this is a small town, they captured them on video, they're gonna close this case. And I didn't think much of it again until that first year of COVID. And that's how I ultimately ended up finding your podcast, because I was like, whatever happened to those girls? And I was shocked. But I was curious, I've never asked you guys, what was it that caused you to gravitate to this case?
So, like you, I had sort of caught a hold of it, or kind of first been aware of it in 2017. I remember my mom is, also into crime stories and whatnot, and we talked about it. And she's also the mother of four girls. So she's like, she was freaked out about it, because I think she and I were both like, this is the kind of like little cute activity that we could see my youngest sisters doing, like going to the park to take Snapchats, right? It's so innocuous, and it's really heartbreaking. So, truly, like what happened to Libby and Abby could happen to anybody. And I was in the same boat as you. I remember telling her, like, I'm sure they'll find him pretty quickly, because they got him on this video. And when we didn't really kind of end up doing anything with it until, with the podcast, at least until, years passed. Kevin and I got married, moved back to Indiana. And
I'll say, I heard about the case in 2017. And at the time the murders happened, I had a family member who was having a pretty serious health crisis in the hospital. And so I remember I wasn't paying a lot of attention beyond just headlines. And so by the time that situation was resolved, it felt like the story of this case was so unbelievably complicated. Even by that point, I felt like there was no way I could even catch up. And so I kind of stayed away from the case until after we moved back to Indiana. My birth sister, Laura, she and others really started to encourage us to cover the case.
And I think what I saw was, this is a story that means a lot to the people of Indiana. And what really, I guess, spurred me to want to cover it was there's so little that we know, right? At that point, there was so little public information. And obviously you have to understand, that certain things need to be kept quiet for the sake of an investigation. But at the time, I was just like, there's got to be something more to this. Is it possible that, we could, help things by raising more awareness or putting out more information? So, yeah, I don't know. That was kind of where we were starting from. And then things started to happen very quickly.
And that was you were saying 2020 was when you originally started looking into the case?
Yeah, I think it was like at the end of 2020 or something like that. I think that was
I think it was earlier than that.
Or maybe earlier. Yeah, we did this really looking back, I think we were both kind of embarrassed about it at the time. Just sort of sad episode where we just were like, here are the bare facts about Delphi. We're gonna cover it, folks. And it was like, what are we doing?
And then like once a month we would do an episode like, here's what people say about these sketches. So we weren't really doing any reporting at first. I don't think we started doing reporting until Kagan Klein's involvement in the case became known.
Yeah. No, and I can remember that. I can tell you, how you remember sometimes where you are. I can tell you when I put my headphones on, where I was walking, when I started to hear the Kagan Klein interview. You definitely, by the way, got into the reporting piece of it at that point. In working on the book, you didn't, because of the gag order, you didn't have the opportunity to talk to many of the players or talk in depth with many of the players. What were the most surprising, interesting things that you think you found in the course of reporting on the book part of it since the end of the trial?
This isn't really surprising, but I just think it is noteworthy to say when we interviewed people afterwards. We're talking all of these pretty seasoned law enforcement prosecution people who, have been doing it for years and whatnot. And the amount of people who cried when talking to us about this case was very notable. And then that was making me cry. So it was just a mess. But it was one of those things where these people felt this so deeply. I don't think that really comes across when you're just talking about people testifying on the stand, or you're talking about, just kind of, something that's words on a page. But I think just the impact this had on people and certainly the families and certainly the Delphi community, but also the people who actually investigated it. That was very real. But I think we were surprised. One story kind of stuck out to us, I think, about how much this was important to the people who worked on it.
This is a story involving the prosecutor, Nicholas McClelland. His big dream, his big professional dream was always to become a judge. And there were a couple of opportunities for him to become a judge during the course of the time he was working on this case. The most recent one was just a few months before the trial. A judgeship came open unexpectedly, and he really wanted it. This is what he's wanted his whole life. This would be the culmination of everything. But then on the other hand, he feels a responsibility to getting this case done and done correctly. But he actually went to the families and said, I really have to do this. I have to think of my future too. I'm leaving the case in good hands. And they were like, well, we wish you'd stay, but we understand and we appreciate all the work you've done. And so the families had the impression that this man they loved and trusted was going to become a judge with their blessing. But then he didn't, and they find out by reading an article in the newspaper that another person became a judge because McClelland just could not let this case go. He felt such a responsibility to these girls.
Yeah, and I think it's something that you Definitely, Abby and Libby captured people, and I really think it was them, and not just not just the prosecutors and investigators, a lot of true crime consumers, but even us. I think of the interview that we did, the conversation that we had right after um, the guilty verdict. And Áine, I think you were in tears. I was in tears. Kevin may have been in tears, but it may have also been speechless. I'm not sure. There was just a heavy emotional weight for so many people who were related to the case. And there were all sorts of other problems and other emotional connections. But I do think the girls in the town just, I don't want to say captured the imagination, because I think that cliche doesn't. I think really captured people's hearts, like genuinely captured their hearts. And I wonder what it was about them or the case or the town. What do you think it was that captured people?
No, I love the way you said that. I do think they did capture a lot of people's hearts. I think they just captured a lot of everyday civilians' hearts too, where, people wanted this thing to get solved. I think my view is, I think it was the combination of how young they were and just, I think just the innocence of two friends going out on a beautiful day for a hike, being so innocuous, and then having it go so wrong and become so sinister, and the question being, what happened? The central mystery of, like, who did this, what happened, and people are getting so few details. So that drew them into the mystery. But I think then what kept them there was just these girls not getting justice, and the idea that, like, this is unsolved and no one's held accountable for what happened to them became something that people, it just gets under your skin. You can't let that go. It's just the worst kind of crime. And finding out in the end what they went through in their final moments, it makes me enraged. I'm not going to lie. Like, it makes me so angry. And, and it just makes me feel so horrible for them and their families. And, just thinking about what they went through, it's just, you feel, it shouldn't have happened. And I guess the outrage just kind of makes you kind of stick with it.
And I think also, to some extent, the fact that Libby had the wherewithal to actually make a video of the man who killed her, that meant that all of us who have an interest in the case could look at and see this killer. And so the answer is right there. It's right there in front of us. And so it's just so tantalizing. You want to keep looking and trying to figure out, can I see something in there that will bring justice to these girls? And it also, at the same time, it's frustrating because this girl videotaped her killer, and still there's no arrest being made. Why not?
She gave us the clue. How can we not? Right. Yeah. Because we would be drawn to it anyway, but she handed us the clue. And to the point that you were both making, one of the things about the book that really, something about reading it on the page and the way that you articulated those last moments where they were on the bridge and, who became known as Bridge Guy, it is emerging over Abby's shoulder as Libby is recording the video and their conversations. And then you also take us through the crime scene investigators at the scene. And I think more clearly than anything I heard, that part where you walk through the crime scene investigators visiting the scene, it sort of painted a clearer picture for me than I've ever sort of had. And you did a great job, by the way, of showing it and not telling it. As a writer, I will give you that one.
Thank you.
And it gave me a clearer picture of what happened. And I felt that same sense of rage and sadness. And, you guys know I had the same kind of connection to the case, to the point where, in April of last year, I went out to Delphi.
Mm-hmm.
I met you guys on that trip. Yeah, and part of that was like me putting the case down, until the end of the trial. That was me sort of like paying my homage to the girls and putting the case down because I couldn't handle it. And I'm just curious, how did you handle that emotional toll? Me, an outsider who's not really covering the case, like occasionally interviewing someone related to it, but me as someone who's connected to it, it was that hard for me. How do you keep a clear head and report on a case like that has such an emotional draw?
Gosh, that's a good question. And I don't think we were perfect in that. I think it definitely got to us at certain points, especially, in terms of having an emotional impact or damaging impact on our lives, or, we couldn't put it down at certain times. We just couldn't stop like working or doing stuff or trying to figure stuff out. And, that's not a good way to live. I would say that there were certain practices and principles that we have in with our show and, even with the book also, where, we're never, pre-trial, we made an agreement very early on. We're never going to say anyone is guilty or innocent until we hear from a jury. And then we may say, oh, we agree with the jury's verdict, or we don't agree, or we don't have an opinion. Like whatever happens. But our point was, regardless of which side, somebody might surprise us during trial, and we need to not put our thumb on the scale. We need to not do anything. So in our coverage, we tried to be very much like, this is a strong strategy from the prosecution or the defense, or this is kind of a sign of weakness, or this leaves questions. So we tried to have it not seep into the coverage and just kind of, in a way, keep it more balls and strikes to the degree that we could. But
well, and I also think you literally kept an open mind. Like, people may think that you guys decided, but I remember early on when we were talking about the case, all three of us were like, it's possible he did it. It's, it's da 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 da. I feel like you guys are really honest brokers in that sense and open.
Yeah, we were more than, and it was a situation where we were, in the beginning, I think we were like, okay, like, let's see what happens. And we did stick with that. There were certain points where maybe towards, as we're getting more information, it's starting to look like a better and better case against Richard Allen. And we would say that, but it wasn't a situation where we're like, so that means he's guilty, folks. Case closed. Bye. It just
and there were certainly times behind the scenes when we had different opinions about the merits of the case against
oh
him.
yes, we did.
Choosing my words carefully.
We definitely did do the sort of do-si-do where we swung back and forth a few times on different aspects.
But in terms of how it affected us emotionally, I think it was really helpful to be working on this case with my spouse.
Aww.
Because it really does get to you. And I don't think it would be challenging to be so emotionally involved in this case and to be feeling really strong feelings about it, and then come home at the end of the day to a spouse who really isn't as involved to that extent you are. So if I was having a really tough time with some aspect of it and was feeling really depressed and down, Áine would be able to understand because maybe she felt that way a week earlier, and vice versa. And so that really made it, we were both on the same journey. We both were able to support each other when we needed it to an extent that I don't think would have been possible if we were not working on it together.
The key thing became, how do we avoid dragging each other down, right? Because that would be, if we can understand each other, but we also understand each other so well that if I come to Kevin and say, oh, this stuff is happening in Delphi and blah, 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 like, then he gets depressed. And then we did, so we had to kind of be able to switch off work mode. And at times we were good at that. And then at times that just totally went out the window. I remember this, you'll laugh at this, or maybe you will hang your head and be like, oh gosh. But like, I remember before trial, we knew it was going to be a hard experience. So we literally had we were like, truce. We're not fighting about any nonsense. We are like supporting each other. And we really held to that.
We did.
I'm surprised. Like, we were just in let it go mode, right? Throughout trial with each other. So we could avoid we could just be there for each other. And I think it actually, I would say some of those experiences really strengthened our relationship, which is wild because it was a lot of the stuff was terrible and we didn't really get to have fun together for a long time. But it really Kevin has my back, I have his back in a meaningful way. I remember the one time we kind of got into it a bit. We had a bit of an argument at the Monticello McDonald's. I'm jabbing in the chicken nuggets order on the kiosk, having I don't even know what it was about in retrospect. And we're da da da. And then it was broken up because we had a source who called us.
Yeah.
And we had to be go into work mode. And then
Monticello is a town not far from them.
Monticello is right
here. We weren't commuting to the trial.
I was thinking Virginia.
We didn't go to Thomas' house. We did not go that far, but we
and it's also confusing because Indiana has this tendency to have names that are the same as other names but pronounced differently.
We're going from Peru to Monticello to Delphi to Brazil.
It's not Monticello, it's Monticello.
Yeah, it's Monticello. But so I remember that. But immediately after, it was funny, immediately after this work, this work call that we take and we're talking with this source and then we are done with him. We're both what were we even fighting about? Let's just move on.
Right. Yeah. Well, did you guys, get any insight along those lines in terms of the emotional toll for, I think of people like Lieutenant Jerry Holman, who was working the case from very early on to, second day or something like that, to the end, and some of the investigators who came off and on, and some who stayed on throughout. You mentioned how emotional people were about it. Did any of them talk about how an investigator on a case like this, how they handled it, or as a prosecutor or anyone else, how they coped?
I think they all were, when talking with us, did not want to make it all about them or we had the worst experiences or anything. And I want to say what we went through was just a fraction of what they went through. And then the people who went through the most obviously were the families themselves. But I feel we did get some insights. I remember with Lieutenant Holman, he told us a story about how, they were all working insanely long hours in the beginning. And at some point, then Superintendent Doug Carter was telling him basically he's oh, I'm supposed to go to this concert with my wife, but I'm going to just blow it off. And the superintendent made him go essentially and was no, you're going. And then
so he ordered him to go, as I recall in the book.
Yeah, he basically ordered him to go. And then Holman passed that on and forced his people in his command to go to the spa. So it was it was something, it was forced self-care. But I think there was an element of that. But I think to a large degree, I think even though there were those, certainly valiant attempts to, work through it, I think just what those folks went through in terms of what they had to see every day and what they had to deal with every day. And then on top of that, essentially being largely maligned in the public as these kind of corrupt, evil people. I mean, I think that's understandably, takes a toll.
Well, one moment that really along those lines stuck out for me is a scene that you guys describe in the book, and I know you talked about it in your coverage, of Libby's grandmother, Becky Patty, walking. You describe how you guys had to all line up outside the courthouse because they didn't have assigned seats for the media, or at least for you guys, or some segment of the media, I suppose is a way to put it. But, and the lines kept on getting earlier and earlier, and Becky Patty, so the victim's grandmother, who she lived with, is walking around outside handing food to the people who are in line. And remind me of that line that you said about self-care. But not only was she handing it to, people who were general members of the public or people who had been good to the family, she was, giving it to creators who weren't necessarily good to the family. And, there's one particular person that you mention in the book that she handed it to where there may have even been personal betrayal. And I wonder whether that idea of that forced self-care, something about communities like that, down-home communities, wonder whether there's some element to that of, that ability to be nice through adversity, that ability to stay human-centered. But that really impressed me, that moment.
Yeah, no, it did. I remember when it happened. Becky Patty is an incredibly impressive woman, just first and foremost. Like this is somebody who is not only very smart, but is somebody who has that capacity to sort of behave in these kind of compassionate and forgiving ways. I think I told her, I said, Becky, I would have thrown the banana bread at some of these people, like thrown the tray at them. But she's like not like that. She's this person who's like, I'm going to give it to these people. They've all been waiting in line. And I just, it's impressive to me. And I think a lot of people could learn from that because, including myself, frankly, because I don't know. It's, there's something very beautiful about it.
Grace. Yeah. Yeah. It's grace in action.
It was really very beautiful. And I think it also reflects something about the community as a whole. There's a lot of people out there who have tried to malign Delphi as this most corrupt place in America, the seat of terror or whatever. And it's a community that is tightly knit and that takes care of its own. And they take care of people. That's part of who they are, their Midwestern values, for lack of a better word. Even before the trial, there was a day when Áine and I were in town for like a hearing. And I recall a couple of people came running out of the store where they worked, and they were carrying a plate of cookies and said, "Oh, here, I think you might be hungry." And they give us these cookies and they run back into the store. There's just a spirit of generosity in that town. And it also goes back to the day when the girls were found missing, because so many people took off work just to do whatever they could to try to help these families and try to help find these girls.
I was just going to say that was one moment in the book, and I forget which character it was, but, I was going through the book and it was a little detail, and it was that the person's, I remember who it was in the book, but it's that the person's boss gave everyone the day off to go look for the girls, anyone who wanted to go search. And I just thought, wow, that's pretty amazing.
Isn't that just so telling? Like it almost, I know this is going to sound cliche or maybe even offensive. I don't know. I don't intend it as such, but it just like the community coming together. I remember I was a kid when 9/11 happened, and I lived in the suburbs of New York City, right? And I remember, I loved to read the New York Post and the New York Daily News as a kid. And there were so many stories about like New Yorkers coming together to like donate blood and do things like that. And it just, for such a tragedy, this did show Delphi's true character. And that character was positive. The character was good. I remember Tobe Lesenby, the former sheriff, told us, just simply, it's a farming community. And what he means by that is that, traditionally in these sort of rural farming communities, if your neighbor's barn burns down, you're going to go help him build a new barn. And that's it. And then he's going to do that for you. And there's this spirit of generosity and reciprocity and helping your neighbor that, people have relied on for generations. And I think that still is very much in existence in Delphi.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Like farming community, inevitably someone's crop isn't going to grow in the year, or something's going to happen and you step in to help each other. And I felt very much the same way in New York. I was at the times when 9/11 happened, and I remember this moment, and it's like the smallest thing. I walked into the middle of 8th Avenue at West 42nd Street. And I walked right in front of a cab because I wasn't paying attention. And he had to slam on his brakes, and he didn't honk his horn. And I was like, this is September 12th. And I was like, wow, something has changed.
Yes.
But I do think it was actually a real reflection of who New Yorkers were. And I remember the story my mom told me, having heard all these rough things about New Yorkers. She's like, we were walking in the middle of the street trying to find your apartment. We couldn't. And everybody could tell we were like looking up, and all these people came to guide us to you. And I was like, oh yeah, those are the neighborhood drug dealers, Mom. And they are actually really nice. Right?
I remember when we lived in Brooklyn, I remember there were so many times where I remember like people were so nice, and New York gets such a bad reputation, but people in New York will step up to help you if you need help. I remember this lady helped me parallel park once.
I believe it.
Yeah, imagine me in New York and picture all the times I get lost or have trouble parking, trying to figure out a subway map. And each time people stepped up to help me. It was a very friendly place.
My favorite was Kevin got chased down by these kind of burly construction guys. Remember that?
I do.
And I think for a second, I think I was like watching this down the street, and I'm like, "What's going on?" And I think for a second you were like, like, oh my gosh, are they gonna like what's gonna happen? And they were like, "You parked in like a zone
Alternate side of the street, yeah, right.
gonna get towed, so you might want to just go and remove that, buddy." And like it was like, wow, like that's New York, kind of intimidating, but like truly trying to help.
Oh, that's a great story, and that is to me, yeah, like it's about community at the end of the day when something like this happens. And Delphi definitely was I think an example, I think a great model for people for all the negative criticism, some of the, what I would say, the lunatics of the true crime space gave them. They're a shining example of how you can come together as a community during a crisis and do lots of good. And, one of the things I wanted to ask you guys, if we could discuss your critics for a moment. One of the criticisms that you guys got during your coverage was the focus, and you brought this up before, on Cain Klein. And Cain Klein, and you can explain who Kagan is as a character, but he was essentially somebody who had been communicating with Libby. He was identified because of the investigation, and it led into this entire exploration of child sex abuse materials that he had been preying on girls in the community and beyond. And you guys were covering that pretty intensely. And I remember you guys getting pushback afterwards. And I was actually, this is when I would still argue with people on Reddit about Delphi. You guys are getting pushback for having covered that part of it so intensely. And I said to the person on Reddit, "Oh, you watch. When we find out at the end of this, we're going to find out that everything that they reported ended up being accurate." But I don't want to not touch on Kagan, because in the book, he's connected, but he's an important subplot, I think, to the story. But what I was going to ask to start was, did you find, as you're reporting for the book, it all began to make sense, the role that he played in the case?
Cain Klein will never make sense to me, I guess. But to me, it was more, it definitely added clarity to what we'd sort of been reporting on.
And I think a lot of the criticism we got for covering it, I think a lot of people, frankly, didn't understand. I think a lot of people have the view that, if a podcast covers something, it means that's their own personal theory. And what we were covering was the investigation. And the fact of the matter is that Cain Klein was looked at very seriously and very intensely by the investigators for a period of years. And everything we reported on about that, including the story of the search, he claimed at one point that the murder weapon was dropped into a river, and there was subsequently a police search of that river to look for it. We reported on this, and things like that were confirmed at the trial. As it turns out, he doesn't seem to have been directly involved with it.
No, yeah, there's no evidence that he was directly involved. The evidence ultimately didn't tie back to him. It tied back to Richard Allen, right? So it's like one of those things where we're not covering it because we're like, oh, yes, we'd like it to be Cain Klein. We'd like him to sort of win the race, so to speak. We're covering it because we know that that's what the investigators are looking very hard at. And if then they had switched to somebody else, then we're going to cover that. We're just going wherever they're going, because ultimately we think that's what matters. I think the sort of the sleuth ethos is more of like, I'm going to craft a theory or a person of interest on my own and present it to people and defend it. Whereas what we're doing is more of trying to aim a flashlight at whatever the cops are doing, so then you can come see and, kind of have a sense of what they're doing. So I think there's a different ethos there. And I'm not saying it's not ever helpful to have discussions about like, oh, this is my person of interest. Like there can be contexts where that's fine. But, I think people saw us as peers because we're new media, and we're not peers with them. We're peers with the news media, frankly, because that's who we're competing against. We're not competing against a guy on Reddit with a lot of opinions. And I think there was just this kind of people thinking, well, they're reporting a lot on it, so they're arguing for him. But I think we reported on a lot of the issues with Cain Klein. He doesn't look like Bridge Guy. His voice sounds different than Bridge Guy. So it's like wherever anyone's coming in on Kagan is kind of like, I think it was more of like as a view that we were sort of championing him. I guess it's like, it's all been borne out. It's all been proven that he was under investigation. They were looking at that hard, and they were looking at his father as a person, and he was throwing his father under the bus. But when people ask us, oh, do you regret covering that so much? I don't. And I'm going to say why. Cain Klein and his father did things to people, in Indiana and in that community of Peru that were pretty horrible, and I think deserved to be looked at journalistically and legally. So to me, if we gave any victims in that situation or victims of similar experiences any sort of platform or voice in that, then that's something I'm very comfortable with having done, even if that doesn't, turn out to be the end all be all of Delphi, if that makes sense.
Well, and I think, it was, when I say it was sort of an important subplot to the entire thing, I think the story of Cain Klein could stand alone on its own as a important sort of story and body of work and thing that I think people learned a lot about predators, learned a lot about, all sorts of things because of his case. But one thing that was clear from the book was that there was a skepticism about him because they kept catching him lying, lying about, whether he was going to meet whether he was going to meet Libby, lying about little details, but they still, and this is to me a testament of how seriously the investigators took everything in this case, that even though he was lying about some things, whenever he said something that could be plausible, even if it wasn't necessarily likely, they ran it to ground. So as I was reading the book, I was like, I think Doug Carter, the Indiana police superintendent, or someone made a comment about how they had gotten a tip about Sasquatch being under the bridge, and it was actually, that's who was responsible for it. They sent somebody under the bridge to find it. I believe it now, having listened to the Cain Klein story, because the book told me about, through the vehicle of Klein and some of the other leads, they really worked to run the probable and the improbable down, anything they could pursue. And I think I walked away from the book, any doubts I think I had about their competence were wiped away.
Yeah, and I completely agree. Having like dug into it, I think in the beginning, everyone's sort of like, why isn't this solved? Like, and I think we don't need to lionize or put law enforcement up on a pedestal. I don't think that's helpful. The propaganda does not give you the reality. Police can make mistakes and get things seriously wrong and even hurt people in a pretty major way. So we never want to just come in and say, well, I'm sure they're doing all they can. It's a situation where just having looked at it all, I think they did a very good investigation. I think the investigation was beset upon by the original sin of the misfiled tip, but everything else was firing pretty well. I mean, these are not perfect people. They did not do a perfect job, but I think you're absolutely right. Cain Klein shows us, Cain Klein was one of those classic situations where, yeah, it sounds pretty good, but we don't have anything directly connecting him, right? You have this child predator who's trying to meet girls and is, even planning to meet girls in certain instances. And, wow, what are the odds? But there's nothing that actually ties him to the scene. So it shows that they were running down everything, but they also had the discipline to not just say, well, you know what? I don't think a jury's going to like him. Let's charge him and see what happens. They were waiting for the the perfect moment. And they might have internal disagreements. I think some people liked him better than others. Others might have said, I don't know about this. He doesn't fit, what we think of as who the person is. There was debate, right? But I think they got to the right outcome by having those debates, and frankly, by Nicholas McClelland as the prosecutor really holding his fire until, they had something tying someone to that crime scene.
Right. Well, you said, what are the odds? Well, that's one thing I think I learned through this case, that the odds of a couple of predators being in the sphere of a teenage girl who's online are pretty high. Like the idea that there are multiple around, I think that's one of the things that I learned. But you guys had the cake and climb phase, which I think was really, really important. You had the arrest of Alan, which was huge. That was, big day, a big moment. You had the pre-trial, the trial, and the aftermath. I wanted to ask about, we had the attorneys kicked off the case and all sorts of other things. What was the experience of covering all the ups and downs like? Were there any periods? What was it like for you guys? Let me just leave it open-ended.
Well, I think it was interesting with the defense attorneys who came onto the case. There was a level of hope in the beginning because they sort of seemed to be very highly recommended, and we did these whole profile episodes that we'll never do again in our lives. It was we kind of I think we kind of fell into the trap of thinking, well, the prosecutor's, pretty young and how's he going to do this? And we don't agree with him sealing the PCA. So what's he really doing? And then these other guys, everyone's talking them up. So they're going to do a great job. And that completely flipped by the end. It was just, it was startling how much that flipped. Covering the ups and downs was frustrating because it was you guys are supposed to be competent, and everything you're doing at a certain point is just kind of flailing. And it was really confusing. And if we said anything to that extent of hey, we're not sure this is an effective strategy, we would just get flamed by their fans who would be mad at us for saying that. And it's we're not commenting on anyone's guilt or innocence. We're just saying this is a kind of a dumb thing to put out there, and it was just, it was bizarre. And then what made it worse was then somehow we get involved in the story.
Yeah, that was a low point for me.
Yeah.
I don't have the journalism background that you have, Jason, or that Áine has. But I have a very clear memory. I was on my high school newspaper staff at my high school J Day. I remember listening to a lecture where the instructor is saying it's very bad for a journalist to become part of the story. And that's certainly something.
I can attest to that for you.
Yeah.
Hey, Kevin, it's not as bad as when the journalist becomes the story.
There you go. We unfortunately became a part of this story in a big way because in early October of 2023, someone sent us leaked crime scene photos showing images of both girls' bodies. And we really tried hard to close that leak up. And our goal was to deal with that leak in such a way that the public would never find out about it. But unbeknownst to us, the pictures have been sent to more people than just us. We immediately notified the law enforcement and the defense attorneys because this is something that could affect everybody's rights.
And we had no idea where it came from either.
But that led to a domino effect that led to the attorneys being kicked off the case. And
Kevin was actually the one to figure out Mitch Westerman's connection. He's the guy who was sort of the original leaker, right? And Kevin was the one who kind of figured that out online, just looking at friends' pages.
So I figured out that the pictures we were told came from this one particular person. And this person, when I looked at his list of friends, one of his friends was an employee of
a former employee
of defense attorney Andrew Baldwin. So that was very troubling. And so,
well, I'm going to say this. I do feel that after that, and after, that whole situation unfolded, I feel like it was just bizarre. I mean, where this became difficult, there was that aspect of it. But then remember was that at the contempt hearing, or was that one of the hearings that the defense attorney for the defense attorneys, David Hennessy, actually went after us And he was going on about how we were participating in some other leak regarding documents that had were not
Had
leaked.
accidentally been released online, as I recall, right?
It was the affidavit for Ron Logan, who was an early suspect in the case. And one thing about Ron Logan is that Ron Logan was really pissed off that his life had been upended by this situation. And he was known to give out packets of his legal documents to anybody who would ask. So these things proliferated behind the scenes for years. We were just the first to report on it. So it was a situation where it was like, everyone knows that. Everyone knows how these got out there. But the defense still chose to sort of make us an issue, I guess, to like, I don't know. I felt like they were trying to punish us because they perceived us as having essentially like, I don't know, snitched on them or something.
Snitched on them. Yeah, and it must have given you interesting insight too in that moment where you're being targeted in that kind of like clearly unfair way, and they're presenting it. It may have made you must have made you even more skeptical of some of the other wild claims. So I talked to our friend Mark Cohen, who you write about in the book, who was responsible for giving you the pictures, and he said it was okay for me to share sort of my small role in this story. But I do feel guilt sometimes. I have to tell you guys, I feel guilt for being responsible for sucking you into that black hole. But the backstory is that somewhere in the summer, before the leak happens, I had noticed Mark on Reddit, and I had noticed him on Facebook posting pictures. And so I did a very classic Jason thing, right? I'm curious about the case. I do not ask for the documents that he has, like the thousands of other people are. And I say, hey, to him, I'm a little concerned. You're leaking things that feel very real to me. And I'm afraid that that investigators will eventually target you. Like they're going to figure out this is legit stuff, and they're going to want to know. And this is before pictures of the girls had come out, or pictures of Libby's blood on a tree, which also came out. And I just got the impression that this was somebody who was kind of like naive about the way that this stuff worked, had some information, and was going to get in trouble. And actually, why he started communicating with me was because he said, you're like the only person who's messaged me and not asked me for the information. And I was like, I don't care about the information. I care about you not, just an unnecessarily ending up in trouble. And when the picture of the blood on the tree came out, and I knew he was connected to it, I reached out to him again, and I was really concerned about his well-being in all of this. And I was also concerned for the girls, and I was concerned for their families. And he said to me, like, that he was really, really worried. And, for himself, for the families, for all sorts of different things. Who can I talk to that you trust? And I said, well, you can talk to Kevin and Áine. They're going to be people that you can trust. And I think it's just sort of a testament to the fact that I know you guys are solid people. I know you're good with your sources. I know you are good to people. And I really felt, and I think he feels this way, you guys reported the truth. That was very difficult for him as your subject, right? You reported the truth, but you did it with compassion for him. He even said to me, you gave him lots of good advice that he wished he had taken earlier. But Mark's story, and also Mitch Westerman and Rob, the man who was in between them in the leak, who ultimately committed suicide, they're an example to me of sort of like the dark side of what we're talking about. Like, we talked about the community coming together, but, Rob committed suicide. Mark's life was absolutely upended. His daughter was sick during the time. There were all sorts of problems in his relationship, with his wife because of it. Mitch Westerman got charged. There are countless other divorces that we know happened over fights over Delphi.
Yeah.
Could you talk to me a little bit about the dark side of it and the dark side of interest?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think with Mark and certainly with Rob as well, and with them, you can imagine that I don't think either of them wanted anything bad to happen. I don't feel like there was any sort of like, let me do something terrible to this. I think people just get curious about stuff, and that can lead people to do things that maybe looking back is like, what were you thinking? But in the moment, and I think true crime brings that out in us, and it encourages sort of a morbid curiosity. And I think knowing when that's harmless and knowing when it could be harmful is an important thing. And so I hope we treated that subject with compassion in the book, because I don't really want to necessarily condemn anyone. Although, frankly, I will say I do have questions, not for people down the chain in the league, but for the defense attorneys. Because I think the fact that Mitch Westerman was found to have communicated with somebody named Andy in his account and talked about, let's leak stuff, is really concerning. So to me, like, the intentionality would be closer to the original source rather than people like Rob or people like Mark. But anyways, that's neither here nor there, I guess. To me, we've heard about divorces, multiple divorces. We've heard about
job loss.
We've heard about people losing any sort of credibility in a really overt way online, like ranting and raving, essentially. We've heard of people hurting their own sort of integrity. Like,
I mean, among creators, we can say certainly many friendships have frayed over it too.
Friendships fractured, absolutely. Threats, bizarre behavior, stalking incidents. And to me,
and you guys were victims of it too.
We were victims of it. I think you were a victim of it. But it's like, I truly feel sometimes like this feels like a horror movie where it's like some ancient scroll where half the people who look at it like die or go insane. And I'm just like, I don't know, maybe we went insane too and we just don't realize it. I don't think we did. I think it's probably changed us in some fundamental ways, but I think some people just like lost a lot of empathy or a lot of perspective on this, and I don't fully understand why, but I do note the trend.
And also, let me be blunt, when it comes to people's opinions of the case, if True Crime Swine 69 believes that the real killer was John Doe, and if True Crime Swine 89 thinks no, it was actually John Smith, who cares? It doesn't make any difference, because the ultimate outcome is going to be influenced and determined by a legal process and a judicial process. We can be interested in a story and we can follow it and we can have opinions, but our opinions ultimately don't matter other than just for our own benefit. And it's certainly not worth losing relationships or friendships over.
It's really sad, and it's kind of like, I hate to say this, but like it's kind of embarrassing behavior. Like I feel like people need to sort of have a little bit of dignity when they're coming into some of these online spaces, or just like, it's like, I almost feel like there's a weird aspect of like they don't respect themselves when they're letting it wreck their lives. Because I've seen situations though. I mean, this is where it's heartening. We've met people who got sucked in, right? They got sucked into the whirlpool and they got out of it and they were able to swim away and start over, and they're happier and healthier for it. And God bless them. But we've met some people like that where they're like, yeah, I got really into the Delphi innocence movement or whatever, and I had to come up for air, and then everybody threatened me, but I'm gonna just moving on because I'm not gonna let it wreck my life. And God bless them. I think some people are able to get themselves out of it. And I would encourage people, like, regardless of your opinions, if your behavior is becoming different than how you normally act, and if your relationships are suffering as a result, it's not worth it. Like, you're not really doing anything. You're just kind of hurting yourself.
Okay, so I think we're going to stop right there, and we'll continue with part 2 of the episode next week. If you'd like to join me and other listeners for discussions. We can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again soon.